Snow fell in hushed devotion upon the gravel drive, each flake dissolving against the glow of lantern light that lined the approach to Winthorpe Hall. Within, the ballroom shimmered like a captured constellation, chandeliers trembling with candlefire, silk skirts whispering as they turned. Music floated, refined and distant, yet beneath it stirred a quieter current, sharp as a blade hidden beneath velvet. For tonight, society had gathered not merely to celebrate, but to observe, to measure, and, most cruelly, to judge. And among them stood a woman already weighed and found wanting by the assembled company of strangers with smiling, merciless eyes. Miss Eliza Harroway stood near the far column, her gloved hands lightly clasped, her posture composed with a discipline learned through years of quiet endurance. Once, her name had carried modest favor. Now it traveled only in murmurs, tarnished by rumors no one dared repeat in full. Invitations had grown scarce, conversations shorter, smiles thinner. Yet she had come, as dignity demanded, clad in a gown of pale blue that caught the candlelight with fragile defiance, as though daring the room to deny her presence, to erase her entirely, to pretend she had never belonged among them once more tonight. Across the room, laughter gathered like a storm about Lady Penrith and her companions, their jeweled fans fluttering with calculated grace. Their glances drifted, alighted, and lingered upon Eliza with a delicacy that concealed its cruelty. A whisper here, a lifted brow there, until at last the current broke, and a voice, honeyed yet sharpened, carried just far enough to wound. "It is admirable," Lady Penrith mused, "how some persist in attending where they are no longer welcomed." The words fell lightly, yet their echo struck harder than any public accusation could have dared to inflict elegant, unanswerable humiliation tonight. Eliza felt the gaze of the room settle upon her like frost, delicate and merciless. She might have retreated, might have offered the polite surrender society so often demanded, yet something steadier rose within her, a quiet refusal to vanish. Her chin lifted a fraction, her eyes meeting the source of the insult without tremor. If she must endure their scrutiny, she would do so standing. It was not pride alone that held her there, but a deeper instinct, a need to claim even this hostile space as her own, if only for a single, defiant evening before dawn came. At the edge of the gathering, unnoticed by most, a man in plain livery observed with an attention too intent for his station. His coat was modest, his gloves unremarkable, yet nothing in his bearing suggested servility. He moved with a quiet assurance, as though the crowded room parted not from command, but from an unspoken recognition. His gaze rested upon Eliza not with curiosity nor pity, but with a gravity that seemed to weigh her spirit rather than her reputation, as though seeking the truth of her beyond the fragile architecture of society's opinion and whispered verdicts that followed. Servants passed, trays lifted, glasses refilled, yet he remained still for a moment longer, as though considering a choice whose consequence would not easily be undone. Then, with deliberate calm, he stepped forward into the current of conversation that still circled Eliza like a tightening noose. A lord nearby, emboldened by laughter, spoke louder than discretion allowed. "Tell us, Miss Harroway, what proof remains of your worth?" The question, though framed as jest, carried the weight of challenge, and the room leaned closer, eager for spectacle, for the breaking of composure as if dignity were a fragile ornament to shatter. For a heartbeat, silence held. Then Eliza spoke, her voice neither raised nor trembling, but clear enough to carry. "Worth, sir, is seldom proven to those who have already decided its absence." A ripple moved through the assembly, not quite approval, not quite censure. Lady Penrith smiled thinly. "Then perhaps a demonstration is required." Her gaze swept the room with theatrical grace. "If any gentleman here claims admiration, let him prove it in humility. Let him serve you, Miss Harroway, and we shall judge the sincerity of his regard." Laughter followed, bright and cutting like glass struck, intent on harm. No one moved. Fans stilled, eyes glittered, and the music seemed suddenly distant, as though the orchestra itself waited upon the answer. Eliza felt the weight of the moment settle, its absurdity matched only by its danger. To accept would invite ridicule, to refuse would confirm their scorn. Before she could speak, a figure stepped from the periphery, crossing the polished floor with unhurried certainty. The servant bowed, not to the room, but to her alone, as though the assembled nobility were no more than shadows passing through his awareness, and in that gesture, something irrevocable shifted within the crowd. A murmur surged, disbelief colliding with delight at the promise of spectacle. Eliza stared, confusion flickering across her composure. "You mistake the jest," she said quietly, intending dismissal. Yet he did not retreat. His eyes, dark and steady, held hers with a strange, unwavering regard. There was no mockery in them, no ambition for attention, only a resolve that seemed to anchor him beyond the reach of ridicule. In that gaze, she sensed not submission, but choice, deliberate and unforced, as though he stepped toward something only he could see and the air seemed to hold its breath around them. He straightened slowly, the faintest hint of something unspoken passing through his expression before it vanished beneath perfect composure. Then, in a voice low enough to be intimate yet clear enough to command the room, he answered the challenge that had been meant as cruelty. "If humility be the measure," he said, inclining his head once more, "then I shall begin here." A hush followed, deeper than before, as every gaze fixed upon him, awaiting retreat, laughter, or apology. Instead, he met Eliza's eyes and bowed, sealing the moment with a quiet defiance that felt dangerously sincere to them all. Morning arrived at Winthorpe Hall with a pale, reluctant light, as though even the sun hesitated to illuminate what the previous night had set into motion. Word had already traveled faster than reason, slipping through corridors, kitchens, and drawing-rooms alike. Miss Harroway had accepted a servant's devotion, and a servant, bold beyond all propriety, had offered it before the entire assembly. By breakfast, the tale had grown teeth. By noon, it had drawn blood. Eliza moved through the day with a composure so deliberate it bordered on defiance. Yet within, unease stirred. She had not dismissed him. That was the truth she could not quiet. When he had bowed, when he had spoken with that unsettling calm, she had not laughed, nor commanded him away. Something in his manner had unsettled her certainty, as though she had glimpsed not obedience, but intention, something chosen rather than imposed. He appeared shortly after, as though summoned by thought alone. No flourish accompanied his presence, no attempt to draw attention. He entered quietly, carrying a tray of tea with precise, measured steps. Yet even in such simplicity, there lingered an unfamiliar refinement, a grace not easily taught nor easily hidden. He set the tray beside her without a word, then stepped back, awaiting instruction with a stillness that felt less like submission and more like restraint. "You presume much," Eliza said, her voice cool, though it lacked the sharpness she intended. "Last evening was not an invitation." "No, my lady," he replied softly, his gaze lowered yet unwavering in its quiet steadiness. "It was a decision." She frowned, unsettled by the distinction. "You will not address me so," she said. "Nor will you linger as though this arrangement carries meaning." "It does not." "As you wish," he answered, inclining his head. Yet he did not leave immediately. Instead, he adjusted the teacup slightly, ensuring its handle turned toward her hand, a gesture so small it should have gone unnoticed, and yet it did not. "Is there anything further you require?" Eliza hesitated, irritated by her own awareness of him. "Nothing," she said at last. And still, something lingered. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet persistence that began to unsettle the fragile order she had attempted to maintain. He did not overstep, did not speak beyond necessity, yet his presence seemed to imprint itself upon the rhythm of her world. Books she had left worn and unattended were returned, their bindings restored with careful skill. Fresh flowers appeared each morning, arranged not with ostentation, but with an understanding of balance and color that spoke of deliberate thought rather than mere duty. One afternoon, as rain traced soft patterns against the tall windows, she discovered her shawl waiting by the hearth, gently warmed, its folds arranged with an attention that bordered on tenderness. She touched the fabric, still holding the heat of the fire, and felt a flicker of something dangerously close to comfort. It unsettled her more than any insult. "Why?" she demanded later, when he appeared again in that quiet, unassuming manner. "Why these gestures?" He met her gaze briefly before lowering it once more. "Because they ease your day." "I did not ask to be eased." "No," he said. "But you have been burdened nonetheless." The simplicity of the statement struck deeper than she wished to admit. She turned away, unwilling to let him see the brief fracture in her composure. "You forget yourself," she said. "You are a servant. Nothing more." A pause followed, brief yet weighted. "No, my lady," he replied quietly. "I remember precisely what I am." The words lingered long after he had gone. Outside the sanctuary of her rooms, the world had begun to shift in darker ways. Whispers grew louder, less restrained. Invitations that had already dwindled ceased entirely. Ladies who had once offered polite acknowledgment now turned their gaze aside. Men spoke in lowered tones, their glances no longer curious, but calculating. "She keeps him close," one voice murmured in the corridor, not knowing she stood within earshot. "Too close." "It is unbecoming," another replied. "Or perhaps entirely fitting." Laughter followed, softer this time, yet no less cruel. Eliza felt the familiar chill of isolation settle once more, sharper now, edged with implication. What had begun as mockery had transformed into something more dangerous. A suggestion, a scandal shaped not by truth, but by perception. And at its center stood a man who refused to behave as he ought. She confronted him again that evening. Her patience worn thin by whispers she could neither silence nor ignore. "You will keep your distance," she said firmly. "This charade has gone far enough." He regarded her in silence for a moment, as though weighing not her command, but its consequence. "If my presence causes you harm," he said at last, "I shall withdraw." "It does," she insisted, though the words felt less certain than they should. "Then I will obey." Yet even as he spoke, something in his expression suggested a truth unspoken, a restraint that cost more than it revealed. That night, sleep eluded her. The house seemed filled with echoes, footsteps, whispers, the memory of his voice. At last, restless and unwilling to surrender to unease, she rose and moved quietly through the dim corridors, guided by instinct rather than intent. It was then she saw it. A faint glimmer of light beneath the door of the small study at the far end of the hall. She hesitated, then stepped closer, drawn by a curiosity she could not justify. The door stood slightly ajar. Within, he stood alone, his back turned, his posture no longer restrained by the performance of servitude. In his hand, the candlelight caught upon something small yet unmistakable. A ring. Gold, heavy, engraved with a crest she had seen before, not in servant quarters, nor modest households, but upon the hands of men whose names shaped the very structure of society itself. Her breath stilled. And in that suspended moment, as realization began its slow, irrevocable ascent, the truth no longer whispered. It revealed itself. The door yielded with a breath of sound, and the fragile distance between suspicion and certainty collapsed into something far more dangerous. Eliza stepped into the dim glow of the study, the fire reduced to embers, the candlelight unsteady as though it too recoiled from what it illuminated. He did not turn at once. For a moment, he remained as she had found him, unwatched, unguarded, his shoulders no longer bearing the careful restraint of service, but something heavier, something innate. "Close the door," he said quietly. The words were not a command, yet they carried an authority that unsettled her more than defiance would have. She obeyed before she could question why. Silence settled between them, taut and deliberate. Then, at last, he turned. Whatever illusion had once shielded her fractured in that instant. The humility she had mistaken for submission revealed itself instead as discipline. The stillness she had read as obedience became restraint sharpened by will. Even the way he held himself, no longer diminished, no longer folded into the background, spoke of something that could not be concealed, only deferred. Her gaze fell to his hand. The ring glinted again, unmistakable in its design, its crest etched with a precision that carried lineage within every line. She had seen such a mark only once before, at a distance, upon a man whose name commanded entire counties into attention. "You will explain," she said, her voice steady only through force. A flicker crossed his expression, regret, perhaps, or inevitability. "There is little to explain that you have not already begun to understand." "Do not insult me with riddles," she replied, stepping closer. "You stand before me as a servant, yet you wear the mark of a house that does not bow. Which truth is the lie?" He studied her for a moment, as though measuring not her question, but her readiness for the answer. Then, slowly, He removed the ring. The motion was deliberate, almost reverent, as though the act itself carried consequence. He placed it upon the table between them, its weight silent yet undeniable. "Neither," he said. The word struck harder than any confession. Eliza felt her breath catch, not with surprise, but with the sudden clarity of something she had resisted naming. "Then you have deceived me," she said, though the accusation lacked the sharpness she intended. "You have made me the subject of your experiment." His gaze sharpened, not with offense, but with something more restrained. "No, no," she echoed, her composure fracturing at last. "You entered my life under false pretenses. You allowed me to be mocked, to be whispered about, while you played your part among them. And now you would claim innocence." "I claim intention," he said, his voice low, controlled. "Not amusement." "Then what?" she demanded. "Curiosity? A passing diversion." A pause followed, heavy and unyielding. Then, quieter, he answered. "Truth." The word lingered, fragile yet resolute. Eliza stared at him, anger faltering against something she could not easily dismiss. "Truth," she repeated, softer now. And what truth could possibly require such deception? His gaze did not waver. The kind that cannot survive introduction. She faltered. "I wished," he continued, each word measured, "to be seen without the burden of inheritance, without the distortion of title. I wished to know what remained when all that could be admired was removed." "And I," she said, her voice tightening, "was convenient." "No," he replied, stepping closer, though he did not reach for her. "You were unavoidable." The simplicity of it struck deeper than she wished to admit. "I observed you before you ever noticed me," he said. "Not as they do, weighing reputation against advantage, but as one who has nothing to gain from either. And what I found," he paused, as though the words themselves required care, "was not what they claimed." Her breath trembled, though she fought to steady it. "You presume much." "I presume nothing," he said. "I learned." The room seemed to narrow, the space between them charged with something neither could fully contain. "And what did you learn?" she asked, quieter now. "That dignity endures even when stripped of witness," he answered. "That kindness persists even when it is neither returned nor rewarded. And that strength, true strength, does not demand recognition to exist." She turned away, the weight of his words pressing too close, too personal. "You speak as though I were a lesson." "I speak as one who was changed," he said. Silence fell again, deeper this time, threaded with something fragile and unresolved. "You had no right," she said at last, though her voice lacked conviction, "to decide such things without my knowledge." "No," he agreed. "I had no right." The admission disarmed her more than denial could have. "And yet," he continued, "I would not undo it." She turned back sharply. "You would not?" "No." "Even knowing what it has cost me?" she demanded. His expression shifted then, something unguarded breaking through the careful control he had maintained. "Do you believe I have not counted that cost?" "Then why?" she pressed, her voice rising despite herself. "Why continue this charade?" "Because," he said, and for the first time, there was no restraint in his voice, "it ceased to be a charade." The words hung between them, unsteady, dangerous. Eliza felt something fracture within her, something she had kept carefully contained. "Do not," she said, almost pleading now. "Do not turn this into something it is not." "And what is it not?" he asked softly. "It is not," she faltered, the words refusing to form. "It is not real." His gaze softened, though it did not retreat. "It is the only thing that has been." The quiet certainty in his voice unsettled her more than any declaration could have. For a moment, neither moved. Then, faintly, from beyond the door, came the sound of footsteps, hesitant, lingering. And with it, the unmistakable shift of a presence not meant to be known. Eliza's breath stilled. Because whatever truth had just been spoken had not remained theirs alone. The morning sun spilled pale gold across the estate grounds, catching the dew upon manicured lawns and sending prisms of light scattering across the stone pathways. Word had already spread like wildfire. The servant of Winthorpe Hall was no servant at all. Whispers ran through the town and estate alike, some awed, some scandalized, and many eager to assign blame. Eliza Harroway walked the gravel paths with a measured calm, her skirts brushing the ground, her fingers lightly gripping the folds as though they might steady her resolve. The world had shifted beneath her feet, and she felt the tremor even now. The Duke appeared at the edge of the garden, the morning light catching the glint of his signet ring. No longer disguised, he wore the elegance of his station with natural ease, but there was a restraint in his posture that betrayed the careful deliberation of a man who had learned humility in quiet service. His eyes found hers, steady and unwavering, and the air seemed to tighten between them, as though all that had passed, the deception, the whispers, the stolen intimacies, had condensed into a single moment of reckoning. "Miss Harroway," he said, his voice carrying across the short distance, resonant yet controlled, "I believe it is time for truth without shadow." She did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to speak, allowing the weight of the morning and the watchful gaze of society to settle between them. The estate staff, the lingering guests, even the gardeners who had paused their work, seemed to hold their breath. She drew in a slow, measured breath and met his gaze with a courage that had been forged in hardship. "And what truth is this?" she asked, her voice steady though her heart betrayed her. "That I am who I have always been," he said, "and that I came to you not in obedience to duty, nor curiosity, nor amusement, but out of choice. A choice born of the knowledge that no title could measure what I wished to find." "Choice," she repeated, the word tasting bitter. "You speak of choice, yet you cloaked yourself in deception. You made me vulnerable to ridicule, to whispers, to the judgment of every eye that fell upon me. How can this be choice and honesty at once?" He stepped closer, closing the distance with deliberate grace. "Because, in knowing the truth of myself, I learned the truth of you. And nothing in society's gaze could diminish it. I would not undo a single moment, even those that caused discomfort, for they revealed your strength, your dignity, your impervious heart." The last words lingered, soft yet resonant, and in them was the weight of sincerity that no mask could disguise. Eliza's lips parted, as though she might speak, yet the words caught in her throat. She had anticipated declarations of wealth, of lineage, of ownership, but never this unguarded acknowledgment of her person, unencumbered by status or expectation. And yet, even as admiration stirred, another shadow arose, the bitter memory of betrayal. "And now?" she asked finally. "Now that you are revealed, now that the eyes of the world measure me by association with you, what then? Am I merely the object of fascination, the woman who captured a duke's fancy, or am I still the one I was before all of this?" He regarded her silently, the morning light casting sharp lines across his features. Then he spoke, each word deliberate, a steady rhythm that seemed to resonate with her own heartbeat. "You are unchanged," he said, "save for the eyes of others. And I, if I have any claim at all, wish only to stand beside you, not above you." The simplicity of the phrase carried an audacity far greater than any flourish could offer. A murmur rippled through the nearby gathering. Guests and staff alike had paused, uncertain whether to intervene or remain witnesses. Eliza felt the pull of decorum, the weight of societal expectation pressing upon her shoulders. To accept would invite admiration, perhaps even envy, but to refuse risked scandal, a perception of disdain. She measured him carefully, noting the gravity in his eyes, the steadiness of his stance, the sincerity of his restraint. And yet, the old ache of doubt, the lingering suspicion that love in the shadow of deception might never endure, clenched her heart. "You presume," she said finally, her voice quiet yet resolute, "that my heart may be won by declaration alone." "I presume nothing," he replied, stepping closer, careful not to invade her space, yet closing the distance enough to bridge years of misapprehension. "I only hope that in time, what you have seen of my devotion, of my attention, of my regard, may speak louder than titles, louder than rumor, louder than any deception that came before." She turned away, walking slowly along the garden path, the crunch of gravel a stark punctuation to the words. He followed at a measured pace, never rushing, never imposing, each step a quiet assertion of presence. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and roses, a juxtaposition of fragrance and storm, reflecting the tumult within her. "And if I do not wish this?" she asked, her voice breaking the tension but not her resolve. "If I refuse the world's scrutiny and your claim alike? Then I will remain," he said simply, "not as a master, not as a title, but as one who has learned the value of your heart above all else." There was no arrogance in his tone, no demand, only the weight of sincerity laid bare. They paused at the fountain, where the water shimmered with fractured reflections of sky and stone. Her gaze fell to the rippling surface, catching the distorted images of their figures, the line between servant and duke, between observer and participant, blurred by water and light. For a long moment, she considered retreat, the safety of distance, the comfort of propriety untouched by scandal. And yet, she could not deny the shift within her, the stirrings of recognition that the man before her, regardless of title or station, had seen her fully, had chosen her beyond the expectations of the world. "I cannot," she said softly, turning to meet him again, "ignore the past. I cannot erase what I felt, or what I feared." "Nor would I ask it," he replied. "I ask only that you see the present, that you judge by what I am now, not what I appeared to be." Her lips pressed together, and for a long moment, the garden was silent but for the whisper of leaves stirred by a hesitant breeze. The tension that had defined their encounter, the deceit, the scandal, the quiet intimacy of service, coiled and uncoiled like the water in the fountain, waiting for release. Finally, she nodded, almost imperceptibly, a motion so slight that only he could notice. "Then we are to stand together," she said, her voice firming, "though I make no promises that the world will understand." "I seek no understanding," he replied, his gaze steady, "only truth." The soft ripple of laughter came from the periphery, an echo of society's watchful eyes. Yet in that moment, the world beyond the fountain seemed distant, irrelevant, unable to touch the fragile bond forming between them. The weight of history, of whispers, of titles, hung around them, yet in the quiet clarity of dawn, a shift occurred, one measured not by grandeur, but by the choice to face the world together, or apart, with honesty above all else. Her fingers brushed his, tentative, testing, before closing around his palm, firm enough to seal intention without words. At that instant, the collective breath of the world seemed to pause, as though time itself acknowledged the rare audacity of choice unbound by expectation. And yet, even as connection was affirmed, a tremor of uncertainty remained, the unspoken question hovering in the morning light. Could devotion forged in secrecy withstand the scrutiny of revelation? Could love survive the weight of society's gaze unbroken? The Duke's eyes met hers once more, steady and resolute. "Then we begin," he said quietly, "not as master and servant, nor as curiosity and subject, but as those who choose one another." Eliza's heart responded before her voice could, a quiet, unyielding acknowledgment that the shift had occurred, irrevocable and perilous. And in that instant, as the sun climbed higher and the estate stirred to life around them, the world beyond the garden remained unaware that its most scandalous whisper had found its own fragile resolution. Yet in the distance, a shadow moved, deliberate and unobserved, carrying knowledge of the secret not yet fully revealed, a presence that promised the past might yet intrude, and that the delicate balance of trust and desire they had forged would be tested once more. The rain fell in steady, silver threads, drumming softly against the slate roof of Winthorpe Hall and forming puddles upon the gravel drive. The morning had arrived as though it carried its own melancholy, gray and persistent, but Eliza moved through it with deliberate steps, the hem of her gown brushing damp earth. Each drop of rain seemed to echo the turmoil within her, a reckoning she could no longer evade. She had accepted truth, embraced choice, yet even in the clarity of decision, the world pressed upon her, questioning whether love born in secrecy could endure in revelation. At the gate, he waited. The Duke, resplendent even in the softened light of morning, stood with that unshakable calm she had come to recognize. His coat bore the faint sheen of rain, and his hair, dark and damp, clung slightly to his brow. There was no arrogance in his posture, no demand in his gaze, only the weight of sincerity, and the unspoken admission that all other defenses had been abandoned. He had crossed the threshold of titles and station, leaving only the man he had become at her service. "Eliza," he said, his voice low but carrying over the muted patter of rain. "I have followed you here, though it is not my estate, not my claim. I have crossed propriety and expectation alike to find you, and yet—" his words faltered, a brief shadow flickering across his expression. "I cannot force what you may or may not give." She met his gaze, feeling the pull of emotion she had denied herself in daylight and decorum. "And yet you have followed," she said, the statement more than question, more than observation. It carried accusation and acknowledgment alike. "Is that not imposition?" "No," he replied, stepping closer despite the soft resistance of her stance. "It is insistence, yes, but not imposition. I stand here not as a duke, not as master of estates, but as the man who learned what it is to see you truly." His hands remained at his sides, restrained, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed the depth of his desire to close the distance. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet earth and roses, and with it came the realization that the world beyond the gates could not intrude upon this fragile intersection of hearts. Society's judgment, whispers, and scandal might linger, but here, now, there existed only the weight of truth and the tremor of possibility. She hesitated, her heart a tumult of fear, pride, and longing. "You ask me to trust," she said softly. "To trust not in your station, nor your wealth, nor your name, but in your devotion. That is no small thing, even if spoken with honesty." "Then know this," he said, lifting his chin slightly, eyes fixed on hers with unwavering steadiness. "I do not ask you to surrender yourself to me lightly, nor to the world's scrutiny. I ask only that you allow me to stand beside you, without title, without pretense, as one who has learned that love is earned in silence and service, not in display or declaration." Her breath caught. The rain intensified, spattering against the brim of her bonnet and running in rivulets down her sleeves. In the sound of it, in the cadence of his words, she recognized the truth of their journey. The deception, the whispers, the tokens left with care, the unwavering attention that had neither sought reward nor recognition. She had felt it in quiet moments, in small gestures, in the discipline of his presence, and now it stood before her fully, unmasked. "I am afraid," she admitted, the words trembling, "that love measured in shadows may falter in the light." He shook his head, slow and deliberate, as though dispelling doubt. "Then allow me to prove it in that light. Not as your servant, not as a figure of curiosity, not as a test of patience or endurance, but as a man who has seen you, entirely, without artifice, and desires only to walk beside you." For a moment, silence reigned, the rain their solitary witness. Her hands trembled slightly as they clutched the folds of her skirts, the conflict between pride and longing a palpable force in her chest. Society's whispers, her own fear of vulnerability, the memory of ridicule, all pressed upon her, yet beneath it, stronger still, was recognition. He had seen her for what she was, and nothing less. Slowly, she lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes fully. "And if I refuse?" she asked, the words a whisper yet carrying the weight of defiance and vulnerability alike. "Then I will remain," he said without hesitation, "not to compel, not to sway, but to honor the choice you make, whatever it may be." She inhaled, the air thick with rain and unspoken emotion, and felt the fragile cage of propriety give way beneath the sincerity of his presence. A step forward, tentative yet deliberate, and she allowed her fingers to brush his. Not demanding, not claiming, merely acknowledging. He responded with the lightest touch, a hand over hers, grounding and certain, a bridge between fear and hope. "Then we walk together," she said finally, her voice firmer now, a tremor of triumph and surrender intertwined. "Not as master and servant, nor as curiosity and subject, but as two who have chosen to stand side by side." A faint smile touched his lips, and he inclined his head slightly in acknowledgment. "Side by side," he echoed. They began to move along the garden path, the rain softening around them, each step a quiet assertion of choice and equality. The world beyond the estate remained, as it always would, filled with whispers, judgments, and expectation, but within the space of their movement, it held no dominion. They were bound neither by title nor perception, but by the fragile, undeniable recognition of one another. Yet even in this triumph, a shadow lingered, a sense that while the personal battle was won, the world beyond had not yet released its hold. A carriage approached along the gravel drive, wheels splashing water into the air, carrying a presence unknown, deliberate, and observing. Eliza's pulse quickened. Though she had accepted him, though she had chosen, the world's scrutiny remained unyielding, and some truths were never fully contained. He sensed the shift as well, tightening his hand around hers, offering strength without possession. "Whatever comes," he said, low, almost to himself, "we face it together." Her breath caught again, and for a moment, the rain, the garden, and the gray morning all seemed suspended, awaiting the next revelation. The shadow of society's intrusion, the possibility of scandal, even the frailty of trust itself, all hung in the space between them. Yet the choice they had made, the decision to walk side by side in honesty, served as both shield and compass. As the carriage drew nearer, the door creaked open, and a figure paused, revealing intent and knowledge that promised new challenge. Eliza felt the tension coil once more, the realization dawning that love, no matter how true, required vigilance and courage in the world's relentless light. And yet, in that suspended moment, her gaze met his, steady and unwavering, and she felt the fragile, unyielding truth of their union, that devotion forged in quiet service, in risk, in honesty, could withstand scrutiny, could endure judgment, and could transform fear into choice. He squeezed her hand gently, a silent vow in a touch, and she returned the gesture with equal weight. The rain continued to fall, not as obstacle but as witness, and together they stepped forward, into the uncertainty of the world, bound by the certainty of having chosen one another, and by the knowledge that whatever came next, they would meet it as equals, together. And in that shared step, as the carriage halted and eyes unseen watched, the first real understanding of freedom, equality, and love revealed itself. Not in title, not in wealth, not in circumstance, but in the courage to be known fully, and to stand fully beside the one who saw you truly. The final thought lingered as they walked onward, each step resolute despite the shadows beyond, that even in a world defined by hierarchy, whispers, and expectation, love chosen in honesty could carve its own path, and that path, though uncertain, was theirs to claim.